In 1177 BCE, 5 empires that had dominated the known world for 300 years just stopped existing. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, Cyprus, a dozen other kingdoms, gone. Not conquered, not absorbed into something bigger, gone. Like someone flipped a switch and turned off civilization itself. Think about that for a second. Imagine if, within 50 years, the United States, China, the European Union, Japan, and Russia all collapsed. Not just changed governments, collapsed. Their cities abandoned, their writing forgotten, their trade networks evaporated. That's what happened at the end of the Bronze Age. And somehow, it's barely a footnote in your history textbook. Here's what's worse. We almost went the same way. By the end of this, you'll understand not just how the ancient world burned, but why the same forces that destroyed it are quietly building pressure in our world right now. The Bronze Age kings watched their civilization collapse from their palace balconies, wondering where the tin had gone. We might be watching ours collapse, wondering where the microchips went. To understand how 5 empires vanished in 50 years, we need to go back to what the world looked like before it all fell apart. And what we find there is going to surprise you. The late Bronze Age wasn't primitive. That's the first thing you need to understand. For over 3 centuries before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to something that looks eerily familiar: a globalized economy. They negotiated trade deals, marriage alliances, and border disputes with a sophistication that would make the modern United Nations look amateurish. They exchanged physicians, sculptors, and princesses. They complained about customs duties and the quality of gold shipments. This wasn't a collection of isolated tribes. This was a system. The major players were the Egyptians, the superpower of the south, wealthy in gold and grain. The Hittites, masters of Anatolia, modern Turkey, with a military that could check Egyptian expansion. The Mycenaeans, the Greeks of the Homeric Age, the aggressive merchant warriors who would later be mythologized in the Iliad, and the Canaanite city-states like Ugarit and Byblos, which functioned as the Rotterdam and Shanghai of their era, trade hubs where goods from 3 continents intersected. We have proof of this network, and it's sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. In 1982, a sponge diver named Mehmet Çakır discovered a shipwreck off the coast of Turkey near Uluburun. What archaeologists pulled from that wreck over the next decade rewrote everything we thought we knew about ancient trade. The ship carried 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin. We'll come back to where that tin came from because it matters enormously. Glass ingots from Egypt, ebony logs from Sudan, elephant and hippopotamus ivory. And here's the detail that made me rethink everything: Baltic amber from Scandinavia, on a ship that sank in 1300 BCE. That single vessel proves something remarkable. 3,000 years ago, there was a supply chain stretching from the Baltic Sea to Sudan, from Afghanistan to possibly the Atlantic coast of Britain. One ship, goods from at least 9 different regions. This was globalization, Bronze Age style. And here's the problem with globalization. It makes you efficient, but it makes you fragile. Now, if you learned about the end of the Bronze Age in school, you probably got what I call the textbook lie. Some teacher told you the Sea Peoples did it, mysterious raiders, Vikings of antiquity. They swept across the Mediterranean, burning and pillaging until nothing was left but ash. Civilization versus barbarism. The barbarians won. It's a compelling story. There's just one problem. The evidence doesn't support it. The main source for the Sea Peoples invasion comes from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt. In 1177 BCE, Ramesses carved monumental reliefs showing a great battle against a confederation of invaders, groups called the Peliset, the Shurden, the Shekelesh, and others. For over a century, historians pointed at these reliefs and said, that's who destroyed civilization. But here's what those same reliefs show that nobody talks about: ox carts, loaded with women, children, and household goods. Armies do not march to war with their families and furniture in tow. Refugees do. Look closer at the evidence, and the sea peoples start looking less like conquerors and more like victims. The Shurden, they show up in Egyptian records decades before the collapse, as mercenaries serving in the Egyptian army itself. The Peliset, DNA analysis from a cemetery at Ashkelon confirms they were migrants from the Aegean, probably Crete, not invaders, refugees from a world already falling apart. The archaeologist Eric Klein put it bluntly, they were as much victims as oppressors. So if the Sea Peoples didn't destroy the Bronze Age, what did? This is where it gets uncomfortable. The Bronze Age didn't collapse because of one catastrophe. It collapsed because of all of them, at once. Start with the climate. In 2013, researchers drilled sediment cores from beneath the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. What they found in those layers of ancient pollen told a story of disaster. Between 1250 and 1100 BCE, exactly the period of the collapse, the pollen shows a sharp drop in olive trees, oak trees, and Mediterranean flora. It was replaced by desert scrub. The data reveals the driest period in the entire Bronze Age, a mega drought lasting centuries. Tree ring analysis from Anatolia confirms it. Juniper trees from Gordian show a severe, continuous dry period, specifically around 1198 to 1196 BCE. That timing matters. It aligns exactly with when the Hittite Empire disintegrated. And we have the letters to prove people knew they were starving. A Hittite queen writes to the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, "I have no grain in my lands." A Hittite official frantically messages the city of Ugarit, "It is a matter of life or death." He's demanding emergency grain shipments. King Amurapi of Ugarit writes to the pharaoh, "In the land of Ugarit there is a severe hunger. May my lord save it," and save the citizens. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a geological time bomb. 3 tectonic plates, African, Arabian, and Anatolian, all meet there. And seismologists have identified a phenomenon called an earthquake storm. One major quake releases stress on a fault line, which triggers another quake elsewhere, which triggers another in a cascade that can last decades. The archaeological evidence suggests exactly that happened between 1225 and 1175 BCE. At Mycenae, archaeologists found bodies crushed under collapsed buildings dating to around 1250 BCE. At Tiryns, the great citadel was devastated around 1200 BCE. Troy, Hattusa, Ugarit, Megiddo all show destruction layers consistent with earthquakes during the same period. Now, earthquakes alone don't usually destroy civilizations. But earthquakes hitting cities already weakened by famine, already stressed by failing harvests, that's different. You're not just losing buildings, you're losing grain stores, infrastructure, the psychological morale of a population that would have seen divine wrath in the shaking earth. And here's the economic angle that should terrify anyone paying attention to the modern world. Remember that 1 ton of tin on the Uluburun shipwreck? That ton of tin is the key to understanding everything. Bronze is an alloy, about 90% copper, 10% tin. Copper was relatively abundant. Cyprus was named after it. But tin? Tin was catastrophically rare in the Mediterranean region. The archaeologist Carol Bell stated it plainly. The strategic importance of tin in the late Bronze Age was probably not far different from that of crude oil today. Where did the tin come from? For decades, nobody knew for sure. Recent isotope analysis has finally provided answers, and they're staggering. Some came from Afghanistan, over 1,500 miles away through hostile territory. But isotope analysis of tin ingots from Israel suggests that by the 13th century BCE, tin was also arriving from Cornwall, England. 3,000 years ago, there was a supply chain running from the tin mines of southwestern Britain through the Straits of Gibraltar, across the Mediterranean, to the bronze workshops of the Near East. Think about what that means. Every sword, every spear point, Every chisel and saw, every piece of bronze that held this civilization together depended on supply chains stretching thousands of miles. When the world started falling apart, drought pushing populations to migrate, earthquakes shattering ports, raiders on the seas, those supply chains were the first to snap. Without tin, you can't make bronze. Without bronze, you can't forge weapons. You can't make tools. You can't farm efficiently. Can't defend yourself. Can't maintain the infrastructure that keeps everything running. The Bronze Age didn't just suffer a famine, it suffered technological starvation. And that brings us to the 50 years when everything died. Around 1207 BCE, Pharaoh Merneptah defeats a coalition of Libyans and sea peoples. But something else happens that year that tells you the system was already failing. Merneptah sends grain to the Hittites to keep them alive. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, is now shipping emergency food aid to its rival. The safety nets are stretching to their limits. Then the dominoes start falling. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, which had stood for centuries, a city of stone temples and massive fortifications, went silent around 1180 BCE. And here's the disturbing part. It wasn't stormed and sacked. The archaeological evidence suggests the royal administration simply abandoned it. They saw what was coming and they left. The common people stayed behind. Then someone burned it down, possibly the Kaskan raiders from the north, possibly the abandoned citizens themselves. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, left a final inscription in a chamber at Hattusa. It records his campaigns and the construction of a divine earth road, a ritual entrance to the underworld. It reads like a tombstone for an empire. A final appeal to the gods when earthly power had failed. Then Pylos fell. At the palace of Nestor in Pylos, Greece, scribes were still frantically scratching records onto clay tablets when the end came. One tablet details watchers guarding the coast, military units sent to the sea to look for approaching ships. Another records the desperate conscription of rowers. These are the last administrative acts before the fire. And then the palace burned. The tablets, unbaked clay meant for temporary records, were fired by the conflagration itself. The heat that destroyed Pylos preserved the panic of its final hours. But it's Ugarit that gives us the most heartbreaking record. King Amurapi writes to the king of Cyprus, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself." Read that again. Ugarit had honored its treaty obligations. It sent its army to help the dying Hittites. It sent its navy to the Lycian coast. And in doing so, it left itself completely defenseless. That letter was found in a kiln, being baked when the city was destroyed. It was never sent. The enemy arrived before the mail could leave. Ugarit burned and was never reoccupied. The Rotterdam of the Bronze Age became a mound of ash. By 1177 BCE, when Ramesses III fought his famous battle against the Sea Peoples in the Nile Delta, he was defending a corpse. Egypt won that battle, but the international world it belonged to was already dead. So why should you care about the price of tin in 1200 BCE? Because we've rebuilt the same system. The Bronze Age ran on bronze. Bronze required tin. Tin came from a few distant sources, Afghanistan, Cornwall, through supply chains no single king controlled. The modern world runs on electronics. Electronics require advanced semiconductors. The high-end manufacturing of those chips is concentrated in a few specific locations. Taiwan, South Korea, a few facilities in the United States and Europe. The parallel isn't poetic, it's structural. The historian Niall Ferguson has argued that complex systems don't decline gradually. They collapse suddenly. He calls it Seneca's cliff, after the Roman philosopher who wrote that increases are of sluggish growth, but the way to ruin is rapid. The Bronze Age kingdoms were complex adaptive systems operating on the edge of chaos. Efficient but brittle. A palace economy dependent on just-in-time delivery of grain and tin, with specialized elites and deep international entanglements. Sound familiar? We have our own mega-droughts building. Look at the American Southwest. We have our own migration crises, driven by instability and climate pressure. We have our own strategic dependency on resources controlled by potential adversaries. We have our own just-in-time supply chains that assume the trade routes will always be open. The pandemic gave us a preview. A ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal and suddenly there are shortages in Ohio. A virus emerges in Wuhan and there's no toilet paper in Los Angeles. That wasn't a collapse, that was a tremor. But here's the part of the story that nobody tells you. The Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe for the elites, for the kings of Hattusa and Mycenae, for the palace bureaucracies and the scribes who served them. For everyone else, it might have been a liberation. The destruction of the palace economies freed common people from debt servitude. The loss of the complex linear B script, which was only used by palace scribes for accounting, paved the way for something simpler. The Phoenician alphabet, which is the ancestor of the letters you're reading right now. The iron that replaced bronze was more democratic. Iron ore is available almost everywhere. Bronze required global supply chains. Iron could be made locally. It was the metal of the common man. And from the vacuum of power, new forms of society emerged. The Israelites, the Phoenicians, eventually the democratic city-states of Greece. The Bronze Age collapse didn't end history. It cleared the ground for something new. Civilizations don't die because they're conquered. They die when their complexity becomes a liability instead of an asset. When the systems that make them efficient make them fragile. When the supply chains that bind them together become the noose that strangles them. The lesson of 1177 BCE isn't that the barbarians are at the gates. It's that the gates don't matter if the walls are already crumbling from within. We've built something remarkable. A globalized world more interconnected than the Bronze Age kings could have dreamed. But interconnection is a double-edged sword. When the Hittites starved, Ugarit suffered. When Ugarit burned, the Mycenaeans lost their markets. Failure cascaded through the system like cracks through glass. Today, a financial crisis in New York ripples through Tokyo. A drought in Taiwan threatens factories in Germany. A war in Ukraine empties grocery shelves in Cairo. The Bronze Age kings looked out from their palace balconies at a world on fire, wondering where the tin had gone. The question we need to answer is this: do we know where our chips are?